Right. Well, hello to everyone. I'm very pleased to be invited to give this lecture. I'm aware that English won't be the first language of a lot of people listening, so I'll try not to speak too quickly. And obviously in the chat, if there's anything that's not clear, you can always ask. So my subject today is unearthing the activities and contributions of women instrument makers between the 17th and the 19th centuries. I probably should have added in the British Isles because that's what I should be focusing on. So historians, I think, have found it difficult to identify women working in the scientific instrument trades, or indeed to know how many there were. So as I said, I'm going to focus on British makers because that's the subject of my research, although I suspect that similar issues probably arise with trying to trace women scientific instrument makers elsewhere in the world. So over 30 years of research into the British scientific instrument trades, I've uncovered a total of 218 women between 1600 and 1900 who I've identified as either running businesses or otherwise making and selling instruments, or indeed both. So that's just out of a total of over 11,000 instrument making businesses in total that existed between the 17th and the end of the 19th centuries. And so it's impossible to know how many other women, besides the heads of businesses, were employed in these trades or assisted in a family business, though there are a few clues. So the aim here is to examine the various kinds of evidence which shows that women were working in the instrument trades throughout the period under review. So one obvious source for instrument makers is the signature on instruments. Now my screen has frozen, so I can't show my next slide. Typical. It was working fine just now. Let me see if I can get it to come back to life.
Well, maybe.
There we are.
Okay.
At last.
Right.
So
maybe I should also add that usually we introduce our our speakers, but since Gloria is so well known, I think we can proceed.
okay, when you said you wanted me to start, I thought you wanted me to get going. That's
yes,
all right.
no,
But if you want to say anything else, please do. Right. So as I said, one of the obvious ways of looking for British or other women instrument makers is for signatures on instruments. There are very few examples, I have to say, of instruments signed by women. And the few which exist, though, do provide the most obvious evidence. So this is an example from the collections of the National Maritime Museum. And this is a quadrant which is signed by, I think you can see Anne Shepherd up the left-hand side in Bristol. And she in 1676. So she was working in a port city, Bristol, outside of London. So in the 19th century, we have a few more examples, again from the National Maritime Museum, which are, oh dear, I hate these things. Excuse me. I've got one of these things with the now I don't know what's happened to my screen. Screen sharing is pausing. So let's try again. Right, let's try again. One of these touch pads, and I really don't get on with it at all well, so please excuse me. I should have got a mouse for this laptop. Right, so the next item is by Mrs. Janet Taylor. And this was a lady who ran a navigation warehouse in London, in the Minories, a street in London near the Tower. and she sold a range of nautical instruments in her navigation warehouse, and we have a selection at the Maritime Museum. So this is the first one, which is a compass, fairly standard marine compass, which she sold. And the next one is a quintant, which is just a large sextant, basically, and a octant. And I've enlarged the scale of the octant so that you can see the signature there. That was a fairly standard instrument. The quintant was a rather special one. It's got a very elaborate frame, which you don't normally see, with the Prince of Wales's feathers, because it was aimed at the royal family and was shown at the Great Exhibition of 1851. So that's not a typical thing, but it was something that she made. And then she also made telescopes. So this is an example of a naval telescope which has a frame showing all the signal flags that were used in the Navy. And again, down the side, it's signed Janet Taylor. So that, I think, is another rather nice example. And then she also made absolutely standard telescopes like this one here. So there are a number of things all signed by her which are in the museum's collections. So that's one example of the kind of evidence you can use in a few cases to dig out some information on women makers. Now, in the rest of the paper, I want to look at other sources which demonstrate the existence of women makers and sometimes reveal a little more about their lives and work, and then to look at ways of identifying instruments made or sold by women, but not actually signed in a way that shows that they were the maker or seller. And finally, to have a look at what can be discovered about women who were employees in the instrument trade rather than owners of businesses. So first of all, to look at sources for the existence of women makers. Now, a few women makers had printed trade cards or placed advertisements in newspapers and journals. And one such example was Elizabeth Moffat, if I can find my slides again. Right. So here is Elizabeth Moffat's trade card, advertising her as a scale maker, again in the Minories in London. And she was the widow of James Moffat, another scale maker, and carried on the business after his death. And this card is preserved in the Heel collection at the British Museum. So that's another type of evidence which we can sometimes use. Another woman who advertised her products in a slightly different way was Mary Senex, who was the widow of James Senex, who was a famous maker of maps and globes. And she issued this rather elaborate handbill, which is at the London Science Museum. And this is interesting for detailing a list of her various products that were on sale, but it's undated. However, I can see at the bottom there that she says that it's sold by John Senex's widow at the Globe near St Dunstan's Church, etc., etc. So that was what she was offering. As I said, this was undated, but we have other examples of material that she put out to advertise her trade. And so, for example, in 1747, so that's some 7 years after John Senex's death, she put out an advertisement with some others for subscriptions for a course on the use of the globes and orrery, which was going to be given at St Paul's Coffee House. So if I can find that. So this is from a rather smudgy scan from a newspaper, but I've transcribed it at the bottom. It says transcriptions are taken at St Paul's Coffee House and also by Mrs. Senex, globe maker in Fleet Street. So this was showing that she continued in business for quite some time after her husband's death. So certainly from the 18th century onwards, when newspapers were becoming an established medium of communication, widows who took over their husband's shop often placed advertisements to announce the continuation of the business. So, for example, after the death of James Ayscough in 1759, his widow Martha made an announcement in the Public Advertiser on the 7th of November of 1759, stating that she proposes to carry on her husband's business in all its branches. So there we go. Oops, a daisy, sorry. Another, I'm having more problems with my ad here. Where are we? Right, there we are. Mrs. Ayscough. Oh dear, now it's jumping on. Mrs. Ayscough, the widow of Mr. James Ayscough, at the sign of the Spectacles and Quadrant in Ludgate Street, optician lately deceased, and she is continuing on in the business. My apologies for this. I don't know why this is behaving like this. It's very annoying. Anyhow, so she carried on the business and in the same shop, and will be very obliged to the other people who supported him if they carry on buying from her. So she says everything is going to be finished in the best manner and with the utmost dispatch. So, you know, assuring people that the business will carry on much as it did before. Another woman who decided that she was going to carry on in business for a little while, but then decided to give up, was Mrs. Peckover, Jane Peckover, who carried on her husband's business after his death in 1757, but 2 years later announced in the Daily Advertiser again to be sold by auction the stock in trade of Mrs. Peckover, widow of the late Mr. Peckover, at the Royal Exchange, Cornhill, clock and watchmaker, leaving off business. Now, as well as clocks and watches, the sale included microscopes and barometers, which were often sold by retailers whose main business was watchmaking. And so they've been included in my database as retailers of scientific instruments. They may also sometimes have repaired things as well. So occasionally, death notices in newspapers will reveal the existence of women makers. So, for example, a Daily Advertiser again in 1749 in August announced, yesterday died at Hackney Mrs. Fryer, who for many years kept the telescope shop under Leadenhall near Cornhill. So that's the only information so far I've found about Mrs. Fryer's existence. So these kinds of snippets can be very useful for digging out people who don't otherwise appear in the record. Now, as far as the British Isles is concerned, another source is provided by occasional reports to the learned institutions of the United Kingdom. And one example was again Mary Senex, the globe maker who I've already mentioned, who sent a letter to the Royal Society in 1749 about competition from less accurate imported globes. And she published that in the Society's transactions to try and make potential customers known that her globes were better. Now, those examples come from the 18th century. For the 19th century, as Dr. Alison Morrison Lowe pointed out in her pioneering article some 30 years ago, Women in Scientific Instrument Trade in the 19th century, by then, trade directories are a useful source for identifying women makers, or at least those who were heads of businesses. But these kinds of sources didn't exist before the middle of the 18th century. And so besides newspaper advertisements, we have to look for other sources which will amplify the references to women makers. Now, in the 17th century, most of the evidence I've discovered for the British Isles about women working in these trades come from the record of the London guilds. London was very much the centre of the industry. There were a few scattered makers elsewhere, but most of the trade was concentrated in London. And as in the examples I've already used, the women who I found in the guilds were usually widows who continued their late husband's businesses. And the guilds in London allowed them to register apprentices as well. Now, I should perhaps clarify that in London, the trade guilds were called worshipful companies rather than guilds, and there was no specific company for instrument makers. So you find these craftsmen who were instrument makers as freemen of many different guilds, partly because sons had the right to join their father's guild in London, whatever their own trade. So I've provided a few examples from women mentioned in these records. So in 1668, the Spectacle Makers Company recorded that John Cosby, son of Henry Cosby, late citizen and spectacle maker of London, is bound apprentice to Alice Cosby, his mother, late wife of the said Henry Cosby, deceased, and the apprenticeship is for 7 years from this day. Now, besides making and selling spectacles, many members of the Spectacle Makers Company also ground lenses and often made and sold other kinds of optical instruments. Now, women were not confined just to apprenticing their sons. So in 1675, for example, it was reported in the minutes of the Spectacle Makers that William Benbrick, son of Joseph Benbrick, late of the city of Bristol, mason deceased, is bound to Elizabeth Clark, widow, late the wife of John Clark, citizen and spectacle maker of London. Other women who were working in instrument trades were mentioned in searches carried out by the 17th century London companies to ensure either that those producing the goods were actually members of a company and not working illegally. You had to be a freeman of one of the guilds in order to work in London. And also they were checking on the quality of the items being offered for sale, whether the seller was a member of their guild or not. So the company of clockmakers, for example, claimed supervision over mathematical instruments and their makers, as well as clocks and watches. And they held a search in February 1671, old style, and they reported that from Mr. Charles Danley, a seller of canes at the sign of the Grapes in Fleet Street, 2 sundials for posts, affirmed by him to be made or sold to him by Widow Cater, and they seized these sundials as being imperfect. Similarly, the Spectacle Makers Company made searches in the 1670s, and there were several, all of which mentioned Elizabeth Jenkinson, widow of John, who had died in 1669. And until 1680, she continued to pay the quarterly fees which guild members were supposed to contribute to their guild. And this example again shows that some of these widows continued to trade for many years after their husband had died, and so they were quite clearly successful businesswomen. To take a slightly more detailed example, which provides some light on this, and this is about Jane Hayes. She was the widow of Walter Hayes, who was a mathematical instrument maker at the sign of the Cross Daggers in Moorfields in London, and he was a member of both the grocers and the clockmakers companies. He died either at the end of 1687 or early 1688, leaving most of his estate to Jane, who continued the business. And she also apparently took over her husband's apprentices. Although this wasn't formally recorded in the guild's records, Edmund Culpeper, who was one of his apprentices and later became one of the leading mathematical and optical instrument makers in London, had begun his apprenticeship with Walter in 1684, so 3 years or so before he died, so suggesting that he continued his training under the widow. And nearly after a decade after Walter's death, Jane is known to have carried on supplying mathematical instruments to Christ's Hospital Mathematical School in 1696 and 7. But not long after that, she seems to have passed the management of the shop in Moorfields to Edmund Culpeper, who was recorded as trading at that address by about 1700. But it's notable that Jane seems to have kept the ownership of the business, as when she died in 1710, she left a detailed will in which her address was still given as Moorfields, and she bequeathed to Mr. Edmund Culpeper, my late servant, all my shop goods and lodestone belonging to the trade of a mathematical instrument maker, also all my mathematical books and the copy of Gunter's Quadrant book. So she was obviously still in control of all these properties when she finally made her will and passed them on to her successor. Now, as in the case of Jane Hayes, Occasionally, women makers can be identified in the accounts of institutions to which they supplied instruments, and Christ's Hospital School in London was an important example. The mathematical school there had been founded to educate boys in the subjects they would need to become officers in both the merchant and the Royal Navies, such as navigation. So they had a particular need for mathematical instruments. So if we look at the school's account books, if I can get that to come up. No, that's not the one I wanted. So in the school's account books, Elizabeth Toogood, Elizabeth Seller, Anne Ware, Mary Senex, Hannah Adams, and Mary de Grey all supplied instruments between the late 17th century and the early 19th century. So Elizabeth Toogood, for example, was the widow of John of the Joiners Company, and she received several payments for mathematical instruments to a total value of over £33, which was a considerable sum at that time. The other women were all widows of well-known makers at that time, and we've obviously already spoken about Mary Senex, and they had all continued their husbands' businesses. Other institutional records, which have yielded names of women instrument makers, are insurance company archives. Now, sometimes these sources are the only evidence found so far for women working in that trade. So, for example, Mrs. Letitia Carver, who took out a Sun insurance policy in 1761, was described as a widow, a dealer in mathematical instruments of Angel Court in East Smithfield, London, and Anne Featley, mathematical instrument maker and lamp manufacturer of G Street, London, whose policy was dated 1815, and both of those are not otherwise known other than from these records. Now, while most of the women we've talked about who carried on a business were widows who continued the family concern, there were a few, such as Mary Dicas, who were daughters of deceased instrument makers. She too appeared in insurance records after she took over her father's business in Liverpool and was described as a mathematical and philosophical and optical instrument maker when she took out her policy with Sun Insurance in 1802. And she insured her stock in trade, utensils and household goods for a total of £700, which was a considerably larger figure than the average for instrument makers, which was around 300 or 400. Occasionally, women's trade literature throws further light on their work. So, for example, to take Mary Dicas again, she marketed saccharometers for use in the brewing trade, and the booklet she published to explain their use throws further light on her background. So these are the directions for the use of the patent saccharometer, and in the detailed stuff notes there, which you may find difficult to read, but which I've tried to enlarge, she says that for 16 years, these saccharometers have been made only by John Dicas's daughter and successor, Mary Arstle, that's her married name, late Mary Dicas, mathematical instrument maker, Liverpool, the only proprietor of the patent, who for some time, previous to the decease of her father, assisted in making the above instruments. So that's an interesting example of the way in which not only the wives, but other members of the family, including female members, got involved in the family business. And she was using that to, prove her experience and reliability in making these particular objects. Later issues of these directions for the saccharometer show that Mary was in turn succeeded by her sister Anne in making these items. Now, very occasionally, women were apprenticed to instrument makers. For instance, in 1737, Susanna Passavant became the apprentice of George Wildy, an optical instrument maker, and later became a freeman of the Spectacle Makers Company in her own right. She eventually had her own toy shop, as it was called, which in that period, didn't mean something selling things for children, but small gadgets, accessories, jewelry, and other personal items for adults. And they also sold very often small decorative items such as pocket telescopes with fancy shagreen cases and what were called polemoscopes for the theatre. And this is her trade card, which was in the Heel collection in London. And you can see that she's completed her trade card in both English and French. So she was obviously intending to sell her wares either to French people visiting London or possibly even to export them. So this suggests, again, quite a substantial trade. And she continued to pay quarterly fees to the Spectacle Makers Company until 1761. So again, her business was quite long-lived. Just occasionally, there are other sources which can reveal a little more. We've already seen one example in the will of Jane Hayes, and another was the will of Martha Ayscough, who, as I've already noted, was the widow of James and continued her husband's business until her own death in late 1766 or early 67. Now, like that of Jane Hayes, her will reveals the name of the workman she employed, because she had no children, and so she gave and bequeathed unto my faithful servant Joseph Linnell the remainder of the lease of my house in Ludgate Street, the goodwill of my shop, and the fixtures thereof. So again, you can trace some of the succession of different instrument-making businesses that goes through a woman controlling one of them for a time. Perhaps rather better known in the second half of the 18th century is the Adams family, who were amongst the leading makers of the period. George Adams Sr. and two of his sons, George Jr. and Dudley, were well known and exported instruments to many countries across Europe, and indeed America. But it's also clear that several of the women in the family also played a role in the family business. Anne Adams was the second wife of the older George, and when he died, she acted quickly to ensure the continuation of the business and placed an advertisement in the London newspapers, if I can find it. Excuse me. So this was in the Daily Advertiser on the 28th of October 1772, which was only 4 days after the funeral, and indeed the probate had also been obtained on the same day as the funeral, so she had got to work quickly. So this says Anne and George Adams, that's her son, who had just completed his apprenticeship, mathematical instrument makers to His Majesty at Tycho Brahe's Head, 60 Fleet Street, begged leave to acquaint the nobility, gentry, etc., that they carry on the business of Mr. Adams in the mathematical, philosophical, and optical branches as in his lifetime, and can humbly solicit the continuance of their former favours. So Anne was evidently involved in running the business, and this was still the case in 1774 when globes made by Anne and George Adams were advertised in the newspapers. However, George married later that year to a lady called Hannah, and Anne's name no longer appeared in advertisements for the business, although she was definitely still alive. There's no exact evidence about Hannah's role in the business, but subsequent details suggest she did play an active part. George Jr. died at the relatively early age of 45 in 1795, and Hannah, like her mother-in-law, acted rapidly to take over her late husband's role, and was more or less immediately confirmed as mathematical instrument maker to His Majesty King George III, as the Lord Chamberlain's records show she was appointed within 2 weeks of her husband's death. She also continued to supply Christ Hospital School. However, she gave up business the following year, and there are hints that this was because Anne Adams, who still had at least a lifetime interest in the shop premises, was supporting the claims of her younger son, Dudley. So we've looked at various bits of mainly paper, newspaper, advertisements, that kind of thing, that sort of evidence for the existence of women working in the trade, mainly in the 17th and 18th centuries. But what about identifying instruments that were made or sold by women where they didn't actually sign them? So they continued very often to use the signature either of the male maker from whom they took over, or they signed with just a surname or an initial. So again, to take an example of the globe maker, Mary Senex, who was identified in her advertisement as continuing the business, she continued to issue globes, and it's clear that some of them, which are signed I Senex or J Senex, were actually sold by her. So this example is from the collections of the Maritime Museum, and it must have been made after Senex's, the senior John Senex's death in 1740, because it shows the tracks of Commodore George Anson's voyage of 1740 to 44, but the cartouche says I Senex. So I think it's clear that she was continuing to use the same plates for printing the globe gauze without changing the name, but she was actually having them made and selling them. So that, I think, is quite an interesting example. Another example occurred in, came up in a Christie's auction. So this was an octant that was signed on the vernier Ayscough, and that was on the crossbar, but it was also inscribed with the owner's name, Thomas Bay, Annie 1760. And Ayscough, the husband, had died back in 1759. So that again suggests that this one was at least sold, if not made under the supervision of his widow. So I think it's only by this kind of detailed analysis that sometimes you can find instruments that appear to have been made by a known male instrument maker, which actually were either made or sold by the widow who continued the business. And Martha Ayscough, for example, continued working until at least 1766, but her name never appeared in trade directories. They were beginning to come out in those periods, and the Universal Director of 1763 still listed James Ayscough at the business address. So those are just a couple of examples. There may well be others that can be found, but they require quite a lot of digging to find them. And quite often it's difficult to date instruments unless they're something like globes, which have their actual date of production on them. So looking now at women who were employed as instrument makers in the trade, rather than those whose names appear in trade directories and so on as the actual owners of the business. And this is even more difficult to track down. There are very occasional references in letters or guild records which reveal the existence of female employees. Probably the best known example is Sarah Dolland, who was the daughter of the well-known London optician John Dolland and married another leading British maker, Jessie Ramsden. Now, according to a letter that was written by Jean Hyacinthe de Magellan, excuse my pronunciation if you're a Spanish speaker, in 1775, she worked on Ramsden's first dividing engine, engraving scales on mathematical instruments. A few years earlier, examples can be found in the guild records. So, for example, in 1691, on one of the searches, the Spectacle Makers Company was checking for people making lenses who were not members of the company, and also for poor quality goods. And they reported that at Mr. Ralph Harbuttle's house in Dean Street in Fetter Lane, they found John Harbuttle, his son, working at grinding glasses for spectacles, and also a woman, unnamed unfortunately, grinding at another tool. Sometimes women working in the family business can be identified by their signatures on bills or receipts, or at least it's highly suggestive. So this is a receipt for some instruments sold by Benjamin Martin, who was another well-known Fleet Street maker. And you will see that the bill is signed M. Martin. And if we look at the next one, these are both in the Science Museum. I can manage to get it to come up. Right, here we go. This one is also signed M. Martin, but in a rather different hand. And so John Milburn, who made a detailed study of Benjamin Martin, has suggested that one was almost certainly signed by his wife Mary, and the other by his daughter also Mary, because given the date, that would have been possible. So again, these are just isolated bits and pieces that suggest that women were involved in family businesses, even if that wasn't advertised in any way. Moving on to the 19th century, by then there are British censuses of population, which began in 1801, and they offer some clue to the numbers of women involved in the scientific instrument trades, although, as quite a few commentators have pointed out, there are reasons to believe that a lot of women were omitted from the occupational statistics, especially those involved in family business. However, the tables of occupations are probably about the best indication we have of some kind of scale of the women involved. And so this is from the 1871 census, where philosophical instrument makers, opticians, weighing machine makers, and related trades were actually given in the occupational tables separately, rather than just under some general heading of manufacturing. And that identified 5,145 men and 251 women as working in those trades. So again, that's an indication, although I don't think you can take the figures perhaps literally. Again, sometimes the records of individual households do occasionally reveal family members in the business. There were schedules that the householder had to fill out and state the position in the family and any occupation of those in the house. And John Lythers of Glasgow listed his daughter Rebecca in the 81 census as optician's shopwoman. So it sounded like she was certainly helping with the selling of the products that he made, rather than necessarily making them, but she was involved. So those are some of the sources that I've used to try and dig out and unearth information about women instrument makers and the role that they may have played in the scientific instrument trades from at least the 17th century. But as I hope I've shown, it's often necessary to bring together a variety of sources to bring their existence into the light. So thank you very much, and I apologize again for my difficulties with the PowerPoint. I should have managed to find a mouse for my laptop so that I didn't have these problems with the finger pad, but anyway, my apologies.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.